Hey everybody, welcome to another Screenwriting Tips. My name is Tony D, and today we're talking about how to write a fantasy screenplay. So the normal rules apply, 3-act structure and whatnot. The issue is, what is a fantasy screenplay? When we're talking about the genre of fantasy as opposed to, say, sci-fi, we're talking about a genre that is not science-based. Definitely is going to have some magic in there, or something very magic-like. We're talking fantasy, not like fantasy of people like, having godlike powers per se. What I mean is the fantasy is the magic stuff. So it's kind of a tough genre to tackle because it's aimed at an audience that is either very steeped in the fantasy genre or, most people kind of aren't. So to people outside the genre, they tend to view a fantasy movie as kind of like a medieval movie, right? Because that's always the time period it seems to take place in. It's a medieval world, and there are wizards and dragons and that kind of stuff. I've written a bunch of fantasy over the years in comics and screenplays, and I've always had fun with it because I've done it as comedy or close to comedy. I think taking it seriously is very tough, very tough. I mean, Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, they were very successful movies, but they were based on books that had already been very successful. So there was a real sense that the books and their long history had validated that. So no one's going to come into Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit and really make fun of it because they're already on board. The books are classics. And I'm not sure if that's because the books are classics and because they're well written, or if it's just because they've been around so long, they have that prestige. But, it's really tough to sell an audience on that kind of seriousness because it's very tough to make characters in a fantasy realm relatable. So you're already dealing with a time period that a lot of people may not be tuned into. Now, I played Dungeons and Dragons half my life, so I'm totally tuned into that world. I love it. But for the average person, I don't think they have a lot to grasp there. It's difficult to make a lot of modern analogies. And I think a lot of fantasy stuff tends to degenerate into the same thing. Oh, you got a wicked king or a wicked queen or a wicked dragon or some combination of both, and they're just suppressing people and then we beat them. So it's really tough to make that plot feel new unless the audience, you can create a world that the audience can get into. So there has to be more than two camps. So recently they just remade this Robin Hood movie. And Robin Hood's a classic. I love it. But, from the trailer, it just looks like the same thing, right? Evil sheriff, king, bunch of people rising up and overthrowing him. There's not a lot there. There's not a lot of surprise there. So you have to create something that, a world where, is this king evil? Are these revolutionaries the good guys? Like, if you can create that kind of, you don't know who's really the good guy, and you're able to understand king, revolutionaries, or other groups of people, then you can have a plot that the audience won't immediately go, oh, I know how this is going to end. Also, too, like, medieval times, it's like, it's not a fun time. There's not a lot of fun to be had with it, per se. You know, you can always do fun stuff in, say, James Bond, because it's the modern era. There's flashy cars, there's exotic locales, there's beautiful women. You know, in medieval times, yeah, you could do beautiful women. You might be able to do exotic locales, but they're only going to be so exotic because the technology isn't quite there. So when you look at a TV show like Game of Thrones, I think one of the reasons that works is because, especially the first 3 seasons I'm talking about, they're based on books that are relatively successful. The genre is just like completely cutthroat. So one of the great things about that first 3 seasons is you never knew who was going to live or die, and it was fantastic. Now you can't really do that in a movie. It's tough. No Country for Old Men is an example where they do something like that. Spoilers. So, you have to establish a world and then pull the rug out from everybody if you're doing something serious like Game of Thrones kind of fantasy. And it's difficult to do that in 90 minutes to 2 hours. It's just not a lot of time. In a miniseries like Game of Thrones, or a TV series, I should say, you have that time. The shows are an hour long. The seasons were, I don't know, early on they were like 10, 13 episodes. I mean, that's a lot of time. You can really develop things. You can't do that in a 2-hour movie. You just don't have that time. You got to get to the point and establish everything really in that first act. You can add a couple of things in the third act or second act, but you can't add much. You can't add much. It starts to get confusing. Now think about trying to jam all the elements of Game of Thrones into a 2-hour movie. It would just be a mess. It would just be a mess. It would be like the first Judge Dredd movie in that respect. That's kind of what they did. My understanding in Judge Dredd is they tried to do the first arc of 100 issues of the comic book in one movie. Just doesn't work. Now, on the flip side of that is a movie like Akira, animated movie, where that was a long comic book series, and they jammed a lot into a movie, and it managed to work. But then again, that's not a medieval movie. There weren't that many factors, and again, since it's more modern, people could relate to a lot of it. You could relate to a gang of kids. You could relate to the motorcycles and, the elements, the various elements, even though some of them were futuristic, you can relate to them. It's hard to relate to a character like Merlin. Merlin has always been a character. First off, he's a wizard, he's magic. There are all these elements to him that are that involve time travel, where he ages backwards, and if you read the books, and then you also have the audience the part of the audience who's read all the King Arthur stuff, and then that complexes it, makes it more complicated, because although you have to appeal to that audience, you can't totally go to that audience because some of those details are a little too esoteric to get across in 90 minutes. So it's a real challenge. So my recommendation, if you're gonna write a fantasy screenplay, is first, keep it simple. Keep the fantasy elements very limited. Stick with the basics, or stick with a tiny portion of it. So if you're gonna do something, for instance, I don't know, with fairies, you're gonna do a whole fairy realm thing, just stick with that. Don't throw in dragons and magic and, a bunch of other things. Just stick with the fairies. I mean, you can apply that other stuff, but, stick with that. Or just stick with elves, or just stick with dragons. That'll help, limit the scope. Now, if you don't want to limit the scope and you want this world where it's just like crazy Star Wars cantina style, like magic is everywhere, then you have to have very fast and rules of magic. Who has it, who can do it, how it works. You don't have to necessarily telegraph all those rules to the audience, but you have to know them in your head. So there's a series of fantasy books about a world. It's a modern day world with magic, and part of the deal is there's regular magic and dark magic. I don't remember the series of books, it's been so long. But part of the rules were if you use the dark magic, you can get ahead quicker, but you were going to go to hell. And so there was constant temptation, you know, in terms of like ads, billboards and stuff, of trying to get people to use black magic. And it was about a guy who was down on his luck, and he eventually has to use black magic because he's lost his job, he has no money, and he goes into that world. So like something like that, where the physics of the universe are well defined. That's a fairly well defined concept, right? There's good magic, there's bad magic. You can struggle with the good magic, or you can cut corners with the bad magic and you go to hell. So you need a strong, rule set like that in a fantasy world. You can't afford in a 2-hour movie to do what Game of Thrones is, this slow wind up to, oh, by the way, there's magic, and now suddenly we're starting to see it. And by the end of the series, I mean, you just can't do that. You can't start a movie where there's no magic and no hint of it. By the end, having zombie dragons flying around, it's going to be a tough sell. So fantasy should have some kind of magic. Just like in sci-fi, you should try to use the magic as a metaphor for something. So, in the world of sci-fi, in the old Star Trek, the alien races, or some of them, and the Federation represented the Cold War. The aliens were the Russians, the Klingons were the Russians, and the Federation was the United States. So, you could do something like that with magic. The wizards, in some fantasy worlds, all magic is evil. That could be, a factor you could play with. If all magic is evil, then who's on the good side and what do they do? Yeah, there was that movie that it's a movie I haven't seen, but I've seen the trailer for it like a million times. I think it was Hansel and Gretel, where they hunt down witches. So like in that world, it was pretty much witches are evil. That's fun. You could certainly do that. That's a nice, easy rule that the audience can get behind. But, I mean, you look at that movie, it wasn't very successful. So, was it a good story? If you're going to do like modern magic, that helps considerably. But you need a good origin story of why, magic is still going around. If you're going to set it in the medieval world, you should familiarize yourself with medieval technology. You should probably, even in a world that isn't, say, medieval Earth, you should sort of get in the frame of mind of what year it is in terms of the technology, right? So crossbows were a huge game changer in warfare in medieval times. Gunpowder certainly was. So if your movie takes place sort of late in the Middle Ages, you could have early gunpowder, you could have powder, you could have guys with guns. If it takes place early, you wouldn't even have crossbows. You could also use stuff like the plague, which is a historical event akin to Earth. But if you're using your made up, medieval time, you kind of want to get in the realm of like, what's the technology here? Now, you don't have to follow Earth technology. There's no hard and fast rule of that, but that's one way to streamline the process to hopefully get the audience on board. Because, if you do a medieval movie and sometime in the second act somebody picks up an iPod you got a lot to explain. You got a lot to explain in that. Again, we're talking straight up fantasy. It's all about selling the fantasy and how it works. As long as your rules are consistent, as long as your fantasy, magic rules, whatever you want to call them, are consistent in that universe, then it can work. And then the story part, really, you know, obviously the magic and fantasy part is going to affect that, but really you should be able to replace the fantasy parts and still have a good story. So you have to think in terms of two different worlds. So the story, is it a love story? Is it an adventure story? Is it the Name of the Rose crime story? Although I guess that's not really fantasy. I don't think there was magic in it, but it took place in that medieval era. So you need to determine what kind of story it is, and add the fantasy stuff too. I talked about, like, I think in a previous video, what should be your dominant genre. If I haven't, I'm talking about it now. You should pick a dominant genre, right? You can have, but fantasy is sort of it's not a genre that denotes a plot, right? So horror denotes a plot. It's going to be, you know, some kind of terror is going on, and then, you know, something happens. Comedy denotes kind of a plot, an increase of the comedy. Horror, increase of the tension and fear. Fantasy doesn't work that way. You could just keep adding fantasy elements and magic, and that's not going to get you anywhere. If you keep adding horror elements, that sort of gets you somewhere. It gets you to, like, oh my God, this is crazy, and then the denouement. I don't really think you can quite do that with fantasy. You need another genre to have it ride that arc. So, you know, mystery, drama, whatever. Usually it's a drama for fantasy, or a romance, because that fits well with the fantasy genre. I don't know why I'm having so much trouble pronouncing words today. So with fantasy, research can definitely be a factor, not just in terms of the medieval time period and the technology, but also the kind of classic magical creatures you may have in your world. Even if you don't use the classic ones, you can read about them and create your own, you know, using the old ones, the classic ones, more as a template, and kind of get in tune with how they work and how they're often, you know, a lot of the monsters are just metaphors for something else, because they're really, since they don't exist, they're based in sort of the storytelling world, and they were used as devices to tell people certain things. So, the culture can be a big impact if you're doing fantasy stuff. There's a lot of cultures that haven't been explored in terms of the movies, at least not in the United States. You have, you know, the classic ones from Europe and England, Ireland, those places. They tend to be the ones used most often in the United States. There's a whole host of fantasy monsters and creatures from, you know, Asian cultures, African cultures, Middle Eastern cultures that really don't get much play. I was fascinated to read about the vampires in every culture, because they all have crazy different powers and abilities, and certain things trigger them and certain things don't, you know. They're not just straight up the same old boring vampire that if it goes outside he bursts into flames. Like, some of them can walk in the day. A wooden stake doesn't do anything to them. So if you do that research, it can often inspire you and inspire your story, and you're revealing something that really isn't known to the general public. See, it's all about revealing. If you just reveal the same damn fantasy creatures and magic, it's kind of boring. And then all the onus on you as a screenwriter is the dialogue, whether or not, like for me, I wrote a fantasy screenplay, but it's a comedy. So the weight of the screenplay isn't on the fantasy stuff. The fantasy stuff drives the comedy. So whenever I need a crazy thing to happen, I just think of a crazy spell or whatever, and or a totally insane magic item, and I throw it in there, and it works because the fantasy drives the comedy. If it's going to be a drama, the fantasy has to somehow drive the drama, and that's a lot tougher because people don't relate to the fantasy as well, which is why you gotta limit it. In comedies, people are way more forgiving, but they're not going to be forgiving in a more serious movie. A horror movie, in a horror movie, you can't ruin the mood. If you ruin the mood, people will start laughing and then you're done. Drama, they're a little more forgiving. You could throw in a little bit of a light scene, but you can't go too crazy with it because otherwise, and you can't be too serious in a drama either because then they'll break and laugh anyway. It's really got to be a sensible, set of rules that the audience can grasp, and there has to be stakes beyond just like, well, there's dragons here. Game of Thrones, there's a lot more going on than just some dragons flying around. The dragons are certainly a factor, but there's a whole lot of other factors. There's a lot of court intrigue. There's a lot of war and, characters screwing over each other or characters helping each other. That's important. That's where the story is. Don't get caught up in the bells and whistles. The fantasy portion of it is mostly bells and whistles. So, I hate to be so serious. I feel like I'm being so serious in this tips video, but it's true. It's a tough genre. I wish you luck with it. 3-act structure. Go to town. This has been Screenwriters Tips. My name is Tony D. Check me out on Patreon, the Webcomic Factory, and Superfrat. And as always, see you next time.